Okay. Okay,
Okay,
you'll
thank
see a little pop-up that says we're recording. Hello, everybody. Hello, viewers of the future, and everybody who's here. Thank you all for being here. This is going to be a wonderful program where we are contrasting the lived experiences. This is the people's history, which is what Maggie Kase is an expert in. And speaking of Maggie Kase, she's the curator. And I'm sorry, I should have said the people's history of the 1918 pandemic to now. So it's about 100 years contrast. So Maggie Kase is the curator of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society, located at the Log House Museum, which is wonderfully now open to the public Friday through Sunday, 12 to 4. She came over to that position from the Gates Foundation Discovery Center, where she served, and she earned her master's at the University of Washington in Museum Studies. She actually moved to Washington 4 years ago from North Adams, Massachusetts, which is very close to where my sister lives, where she trained at Mass MoCA and the Clark, both of which I have been to. And I'm super happy to introduce you to Maggie Kase, and I'm gonna let her take it away.
you very much. I'll just share my screen and then we'll get underway. Well, alrighty then. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Pandemic People Compare and Contrast Lived Experiences in 1918 and 2020. As Alan said, my name is Maggie Kase, and I'm the curator for the Southwest Seattle Historical Society, and I am super excited to be joining you all today. Before we begin, I just need to take a second to acknowledge that the Southwest Seattle Historical Society and our Log House Museum are located on the traditional land of the Duwamish people, past and present. And I'd really just like to honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. Pandemic People specifically is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, Luna Park Cafe, For Culture, and Home Street Bank. The Southwest Seattle Historical Society's mission is to promote local history through education, preservation, and advocacy. As some of you might be aware, the Historical Society hosts a really wide range of programs and educational opportunities that explore the history of the Duwamish Peninsula, and we can't offer programs like the one you're about to enjoy without your support, so thank you so much for being here. And as was mentioned earlier, our physical location, the Log House Museum, is open again, so feel free to come see us Friday through Sunday from 12 to 4 to get the in-person experience of the Historical Society's work. Today's presentation is all about pandemics, most notably the 1918 H1N1 pandemic and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to start today's presentation talking a little bit about why this history matters, spend some time diving into the basic science, very basic science, of how pandemics are classified, and then dive into some primary source accounts of life during the pandemic from both 1918 and 2020, so that we can talk about the ways in which widespread epidemics like this affect society and can change the course of history. So I think it's pretty safe to say at this point that we are all sick and tired of hearing about and talking about and thinking about and just kind of generally living the COVID-19 pandemic. So, of course, I'm here today to make you hear about and talk about and think about the pandemic even more. Why? Because 100 years from now, there's going to be a historian just like me looking back at this moment and going, I wonder what that was really like. How did people react and respond to living through the pandemic? And when they inevitably start asking those questions, they'll be looking at people just like us who have recorded and told our stories to try and piece together the narrative of what really happened during the COVID-19 pandemic of the early 2020s. When all of this first started last year, I feel like one of the sentences that we heard over and over again was that we are living through an unprecedented moment in history. And at first, on the surface, I was like, yeah, we are living in an unprecedented moment in history. What's happening is mind boggling, and I don't have a good blueprint for how to deal with this kind of situation. But then, as time went on, I started to really think about and question that sentiment. Pandemics have been common throughout history. How did people in the past deal with it? Were they told that they were living in an unprecedented moment? And how was the experience that I was having in 2020 different or similar to what someone would have gone through with the Spanish flu in 1918? And so Pandemic People was born. When it comes to disease, there are a ton of different ways to classify the number of cases and how it spreads worldwide. I'm not a doctor and I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to try and break down how and why certain medical jargon is used to describe the way that illness spreads. Having said that, though, I am going to offer a few general definitions about words that we've commonly heard thrown around for the last 18 months or so, just so that we can all be on the exact same page with this terminology. Namely, what's the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic? So, according to the World Health Organization, an epidemic is the spread of disease in a community or region during a specific amount of time. Classifying epidemics can vary on a lot of factors like what the disease is, where it is, and what proportion of the population has been exposed. Probably one of the most famous examples of an epidemic in recent history would be the Ebola outbreak that occurred primarily in West Africa from 2014 to 2016. That epidemic affected 8 countries and took the lives of approximately 11,300 people over the course of that 2 year period. In simple terms, the WHO describes a pandemic as the worldwide spread of a new disease, meaning that a pandemic ends up being a very specific kind of epidemic. The fact that it's a new disease is actually the key here because the majority of people won't have the natural immunity required to fight it off. In turn, that can mean that the disease spreads faster and to more people, and ultimately, it's more likely that a larger proportion of the population could get sick. I won't dive too deeply into the nitty gritty of how the WHO thinks about classifying pandemics, but there are 6 phases to the process. And these 6 phases don't necessarily happen one right after each other. Often, these phases of research of a new disease end up overlapping and happen simultaneously as the WHO figures out whether to declare the spread a pandemic or not. So, these first 3 phases deal with animals and aim to figure out how a disease will spread. If a new disease is found circulating among animals but hasn't transmitted yet to human beings, it's not a candidate for a pandemic. If a new disease does transmit from animals to humans, however, that's when we start to see a threat forming. After that, researchers have to figure out at what rate human to human transmission occurs. If the transmission rate is low, that typically means that the disease spread will be slow and it's unlikely to cause an outbreak across a community. Humans are at risk in that scenario, but the likelihood that a new disease will start a pandemic is pretty low. Phases 4, 5, and 6 assumes that human transmission of a new disease occurs pretty quickly and pretty easily. So community outbreaks are considered a really strong signal that a pandemic could occur. In fact, once transmission is spotted in just 2 countries, a pandemic is often considered to be inevitable. As soon as a third country is identified as transmitting a new disease, that's when the disease is classified as being a pandemic phase. And from there, that's when we get into some of those nitty gritty details about whether it will be called a pandemic or an epidemic. So, of course, that's a really simplified and pretty linear description of what's actually very complicated science, I'm sure, involving disease tracking and understanding disease transmission between people. Something that surprised me, though, as I was doing the research to build this program was the fact that only a handful of countries need to see cases of a new disease before the disease is a candidate to be considered a pandemic. In the age of globalization, I suppose I shouldn't have been too shocked to find out that a new disease outbreak in 2 countries essentially means that a pandemic is inevitable, but I kind of was. So then, going back to my original questions about what people in history had done when they faced a pandemic, I realized that in some ways I actually already knew the answer because I had already experienced a pandemic phase and hadn't realized it. Between the Spanish flu pandemic and the current COVID-19 pandemic, there have been quite a few pandemics declared. In 1957, there was a pandemic involving the H2N2 flu virus, and in 1968, there was another flu pandemic, this time H3N2. In the 21st century as well, the WHO has declared 2 pandemics, the SARS coronavirus outbreak from 2002 to 2003, and the H1N1 flu outbreak in 2009. The spread of HIV throughout the world is considered a pandemic as well and has been declared one since 1981. all of these outbreaks were declared pandemics. Personally, I had experienced multiple. And yet, everything that has happened over the past year has felt so different. The only true comparison in recent history was the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. There's a lot of reasons that these two pandemic outbreaks get compared so often. There's a lot of similarities in how they spread through respiratory droplets. Some of the symptoms are very similar, and the impact on human life, both if you have the disease and if you haven't, have been really, really similar. But having said that, there's also kind of a lot of differences. With the H1N1 outbreak that we now call the Spanish flu, older adults were at high risk of severe symptoms, but so were children under age 5 and adults aged 20 to 40. There were also a lot less options to stop the disease in its tracks. There was no vaccines and significantly fewer options to treat the bacterial infections that often presented along with the H1N1 virus. In the United States and across the world, close living quarters, a lack of access to hygienic products, and malnutrition also really aided in the spread of the H1N1 virus, and were likely major reasons that so many people experienced such severe symptoms. All of this stuff, though, is in many ways the science side of things. And in my job as a public historian, when we're piecing together the narrative of historical events, there are tons and tons of primary sources that we need to consider. Many of them are related to the science of disease when we're talking about pandemic history. We're looking for sources that track the spread of the disease, that uncovered how doctors and researchers were thinking about the disease, how people were trying to treat it. That information can come from really anywhere. Old newspaper articles, communications between doctors and organizations, research notes. There's actually a ton of historians out there that specialize in uncovering the history of disease, people who focus on the Black Plague or the history of influenza, for example. When we're thinking about the societal effects, though, the emotional effects, some of the human impact aspects of history, those primary sources can really look kind of different. When we're able to, pulling from oral histories can be a really great way to uncover personal stories that illustrate larger societal changes. Though, of course, somebody talking about their life can also mean that they have the ability to editorialize as they're speaking. Often, we're looking for the smaller things, receipts of purchases, for example, or letters or journal entries. Sometimes the most illuminating pieces of evidence are the ones where people are able to freely express their thoughts without thinking about the future, but just reflecting on what's happening in their lives at that very moment. Oftentimes, the people we see in the history books are really well known figures, for better or for worse. They took part actively in history, whatever that means. They were presidents or famous protesters or lawmakers who are painted as having the power to change history. But we all witness history every single day, and by living our lives, we change it a little bit too. Every one of our experiences is ultimately going to influence how historians think about and talk about and write about the early 21st century in the future. The stories that we tell to our families and friends, the diaries that we write, the art that we make, all of this is eventually going to help explain what life was like right now. That's why last year the Historical Society actually started collecting diary entries from people detailing their experiences during the pandemic. We wanted to really make sure that we were documenting what happened and give people a chance to tell their own stories. I mentioned briefly earlier that there were a lot of contributing factors in the spread of the Spanish flu. Soldiers were being sent across the globe from multiple countries. Malnutrition was rampant nearly everywhere. Hygiene products were less available and less popular. People were living in extremely cramped quarters. There was also a lot less access to medicine at the time. There were no vaccines developed for the H1N1 virus at the time, and significantly less access to antibiotics that could help fight off the bacterial infections that often accompanied the virus. All of these aspects contributed to how virulent the H1N1 virus was, and also why it was so deadly. It's interesting then that with all of our scientific advancements over the last century, to compare the notes of doctors who were trying to deal with these outbreaks. On the screen right now, you're looking at an ad for Weed's Pharmacy. One of the things they're trying to sell here is a medication that's purported to combat the Spanish flu. In 1918, 1919, and 1920, Washington State Health Commissioner Dr. Thomas Tuttle was actually really closely watching and researching the outbreak. Tuttle was one of the very first researchers to suggest that asymptomatic transmission of the disease could even be possible, although he used different wording to describe the same phenomena. Tuttle was on the forefront of answering questions related to the influenza outbreak. He was also on the forefront of battling information or misinformation about the pandemic. So on the screen here, we're looking at a snippet of a newspaper article from the Seattle PI, that was published on January 20th, 1919. As you can see here, we see a headline in huge letters that says, "Medical world is baffled by flu. Exhaustive experiments made, but they leave doctors mystified. Every test a failure. Explosion of accepted theories causes science to grope for light." This specific article then goes on to break down a lot of differences in concepts and ideas, praising the hundreds who had come forward as volunteers to assist research, giving explanations of a few key research groups that were happening in Boston and San Francisco, and ending with the sentiment that scientists are astounded by what's happening at the same time. Dr. Tuttle saw this newspaper article and sent it to the Surgeon General at the time, along with a note that read, "Dear Doctor, I enclose herewith clipping from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, January 20th, 1919. I have been wondering if this statement that purports to represent the department's final say with regard to the influenza correctly represents the attitude of the U.S. Public Health Service. Respectfully submitted, T. Tuttle, Commissioner." This set of primary sources that is housed by the Influenza Encyclopedia created by the University of Michigan Center for the History of Medicine is actually a really, really interesting set because we're seeing two different kinds of sources here. The first is that newspaper article, which very clearly has a perspective that they're pushing, right? The tone of the article is simultaneously praising and questioning science and the scientific process. I think that aspects of it could probably go as far as potentially fear mongering. But there's also a lot to break down here because, of course, this article was really purposefully written for public consumption. And then on top of that, the person who wrote it was probably aware on some level that this would be a record that's kept for the future. Newsprint publishings are often saved and archived for many, many decades, even when they aren't kept by a museum. But one of the interesting things here is that it's paired with this personal letter that you see on the screen now. Dr. Tuttle didn't write that letter to Surgeon General Blue thinking that it would get saved for a century and then used later to uncover the truth of the pandemic. But even in just a few short sentences, we're able to gather a lot from Tuttle's tone. It's respectful because it has to be, sure, but given how intensely questioning the article is, to me it also reads as a little bit sarcastic. This is influenced, of course, by my personal bias, but I read his letter and it seems to me like he's saying, really? This is what we want to be published about our scientific process in relation to this disease? Just thought you should know what the general public has to say. The primary source from Dr. Tuttle comes from a few months into the pandemic when questions were running constantly and life was changing very, very quickly. So, to compare, I have a really interesting primary source from March of last year when life began to change very quickly again in Washington in response to a pandemic. A local West Seattle doctor who has asked to remain anonymous very kindly donated their journal to us that detailed their fragmented thoughts as they were facing the COVID-19 pandemic for the first time professionally and also in their personal life. So I'm going to share out loud really fast some of what they had to say. The way that they've written about this pandemic is kind of fragmented thoughts. It actually almost reads a little bit like poetry in some ways. So this is what this journal says. March 2020, coronavirus 2020. Started in a food market in Wuhan, China. Country overwhelmed with illness and death, then spread to other countries. Iran, South Korea, Spain hit hard. First case in US near Seattle, life care in Kirkland, epidemic. Governor went from banning large events, 250 or more, to 50 or more, then closed restaurants except takeout, schools, bars, hair salon, dentist. 14-day quarantines, not ready with test kits, missing lots of cases, drive up test centers, asked to stay at home, keep 6 feet distance, toilet paper and water hoarding grocery store shelves empty, social distancing, shelter in place. And that's the end of the journal entry from March 2020 of last year. So when I first read that a couple months ago, it really took me straight back to the beginning of 2020 and what we were all going through. In this doctor's notes, we see a whole host of personal thoughts that to me just really captured what was going on. And I would say on the professional front, as a doctor, we see a few things. The first, of course, is tracking the spread. We see them noting which countries had been hit hardest at the time: Spain, Italy, Iran, South Korea. We see them talking about the fact that there's a shortage of medical supplies. They note that they're not ready. 14-day quarantines, not enough testing kits, missing lots of cases. And then we also see the things that are professional, but also societal, right? The borders are closing, everyone's being asked to stay home. The phrases being thrown around are social distancing and shelter in place, but no one really knows what that means. Everything is closed. There are toilet paper and water shortages at the grocery store. So to think back to 1918 then, speaking of societal changes, we actually have a few sources now that show even more comparisons from 1918 that look like they could have come straight out of 2020. On the left here, we have an image that shows a group of men in front of a real estate office in downtown Seattle getting ready to go in. In other times, this probably would have been a typical street shot, potentially that didn't uncover a ton about history, but they're wearing masks here, another measure that Dr. Tuttle pushed really, really hard as a way to limit the spread of disease. You can also see another newspaper article. This one is from the Seattle Daily Times from October 5th, 1918. We've got a few things going on here. So the first is a headline that states, "Help bar deadly influenza from Seattle," with notes from Dr. Tuttle and Surgeon General Blue that read, "Don't go into crowds, don't cough or sneeze without using a handkerchief, get plenty of fresh air, and when the symptoms of a cold appear, isolate yourselves as far from as possible from others." And then the second note breaks down the symptoms one should be on the watch for, so fever, chills, and headache. And then below that, of course, we see the ways in which life has already shut down. Churches, schools, shows closed. Epidemic puts ban on all public assemblies. As I joked before, these images in newspaper articles look like they could have just as easily come from the last year and a half as they could have over a century ago. But these reportings don't necessarily get into the emotional, psychological impact of how a pandemic changes life for everybody. So that's part of what's so interesting about the COVID-19 diary entries that we've been able to collect. In the future, we're really easily going to be able to compare people's personal experiences with other kinds of primary sources. So here are just a few examples of some of the things we've collected over the past year and a half. A few days ago, I had my 14th birthday party. I dropped off a bag with balloons and hats and whatever else my mom found at Target at each of my friends' houses. We got on FaceTime and played charades and bingo and Mafia until my laptop ran out of battery. I am wondering if things are always this crazy in different ways and I've been too young to notice, or if things are actually falling apart and it's going to change forever. Another one reads, "It's been about 12 days since things started closing down. My daughter and her boyfriend were sent home because the cinema they were working at was closing. Cinemas never close. I have a friend that missed many holiday activities over the years because he was the manager of a cinema, so I knew this was getting serious, but I didn't realize how serious." And then a last one reads, "Although I can work remotely just fine, it's difficult to focus some days. I miss the bustle of my office. I miss seeing my family and friends. My mom turned 72 this week, the same day 22 people in Washington state died of COVID-19. Those numbers sound good, but I'm not really sure. I'm so grateful for our home. We've had an unusually sunny spring and yellow sunbeams stream through the windows every afternoon. This house was built in 1913. It was here when the Spanish flu swept Seattle, and it will be here after this pandemic too. I'm sure we will be too." So these diary entries are just a few examples of the snapshot of the psychological human impact that occurs when pandemics really change lives. People's reactions to the closures, to masks, to shelter in place were and still are really, really varied. The 1918 pandemic elicited really similar responses in people as public activities closed. The Influenza Archive notes that in Seattle, closing schools especially was one of the most controversial decisions that was made. The Seattle superintendent of schools at the time felt that children would be safest at schools where they could be kept orderly and medically supervised instead of running around on the streets. Newspapers tried to describe what they were seeing with the closures, and one came up with the apt sentiment that they were looking at, quote, a mass of humanity moving aimlessly back and forth, end quote. These pandemics, of course, aren't a one-to-one comparison. People's individual reactions varied. The science was vastly different. Society had a different structure, different scapegoats were used to assign blame. World War I was still a cloud across the globe during the Spanish flu outbreak, but having said all of that, many things are still the same. We've been living through these unprecedented times for the past 18 months, and the psychological, physical, economic, and social impacts are probably going to be felt by us for a really long time. But doing research for this program helped me to realize that while the COVID-19 pandemic is new for us, societies have been figuring their way through them for a long time, and maybe if we look to the past, there might be a blueprint to follow after all. I want to thank you all so much for coming to today's program, Pandemic People, compare and contrast lived experiences in 1918 and 2020. I hope that this presentation was informative. Living through these times and being historical witnesses can feel really overwhelming. And I think that as kids, we're really often taught that if we learn from history, we avoid repeating our mistakes. It's a cliche, but I think there probably is some level of truth to that sentiment, even if the reality of learning from history is often both complicated and cyclical. And I like to think that by documenting our experiences today, by saving our experiences for the people of the future, what we've learned over the past 18 months and what we'll continue to learn until the pandemic is declared over will help make people make more informed decisions when the time comes to deal with the pandemic again. So thank you all very, very much. I hope you enjoyed today's program, and I can stick around for a little while to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Sorry, a little choked up. Thank you, Maggie. It was a great presentation and so much information in such a short amount of time. And I had to get up once or twice, so I missed some of it. So I apologize if this question is ignorant, and I'm sure we have questions from our other room as well. But you mentioned you're recording some diary entries and local histories during this unprecedented time. It's kind of like a misnomer, but I think it's really interesting even to delve into that the way you did. But how much of that do you have? Like, and how are you collecting? Are you getting recordings? Are people typing you emails, messages, texts? Like, how is that coming in, and how much do you have?
So we have about, oh man, we've got quite a few dozen experiences at this point. They are mostly submitted to us through our website where people can submit online and kind of give us their diary entries. Having said that, though, if anyone's interested in kind of documenting their experience and aren't that comfortable online, feel free to let me know and I can take them in a different way. We've had a couple of different doctors donate their journals over the past couple of months, just saying, when we didn't know the answers to any of these questions, this is what I was thinking as I was seeing people, as I was trying to track cases. So that's been really fun. We're
Okay.
also not the only museum doing this. We're kind of currently working by ourselves on this project, but I'm sure over the next couple of years, all of us are going to come together. I know UW has a program, and so does Mohi, and just kind of figure out what do we actually have here, because these personal accounts are extremely powerful.
Yeah, and if sorry to keep butting in, I'm usually supposed to be here just to listen and record and stuff. But if I wanted to put people in touch with you, would they just get in touch with me and I can send them to you? I can give your contact information to them. Is
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
okay? Excellent, excellent. So I'm at extension 5204. So call me and I will get you connected with Maggie. So now we'll let other people talk.
Maggie, thank you so very much. We have 6 residents here in assisted living who are, Fred has a question, and I'll point him to you so you can see him. Fred, go ahead and, sorry, our video is not the best, but I'll repeat the question once I hear it.
Perfect.
Watch her lips. Figure out. I don't know why people get behind that. Why, no, they think they have to go like so fast. Well, the old people, they do themselves in by not going slowly. But that's on the evening newspaper, paper, and all of those. You know, go way too fast.
Oh, okay. So recommendation, because Maggie, I know you have a 3:30. Fred just mentioned he would appreciate if you just slow it down just a little bit for your next presentation.
Can do.
Okay, thank you so much. He just was saying that he reads lips, and so he was struggling just simply because you were speaking normal pace.
Sorry,
Okay.
Fred.
Okay, thank you. Now, would anybody like to ask Maggie a specific question about either the pandemic that we're currently experiencing or the 1918 pandemic? Inga has a question for you.
I was expecting a little comparison of the experience of the people at the time when this happened, how they responded, how they did not respond, and how they handled the scariness of the experience. So much of what they're going through, there's no mention of that. I don't know if you can answer that because you come from a different aspect and we're still in it, in the experience. And if we don't have anything to compare it to, the level to which this has risen, we can't even imagine what people have gone through because they were not there to tell us. I don't know if you can answer. It seems an impossible question, but you may have some ideas about it.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. From what I heard, we were talking about the fact that we don't have a ton of primary sources that talk about how individuals were really feeling in 1918, how they were dealing with the scariness of the situation and things like that. Is that what the question was? Because I can expand on that a little bit.
Yes, partly because my own parents immigrated to another country around that time. Many people moved to Mexico. That's where I was born. That's where the idea came. And they came back after the war, years after the war. But a whole group of German people just left during the heat. So it must have had an effect on the folks who said, well, we've got to go somewhere else. Now we have quarantines. And I don't know that anything like that was available for that reason. People immigrated anyway. But I was just curious if you had any responses in the literature or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It is kind of tricky because sort of what I was mentioning before is part of the reason that we're documenting how people feel now is because we don't have a ton of recorded experiences of how individuals were feeling in the past in 1918. I would say, though, that from the couple that I was able to find, there was a really looming sense of uncertainty. And there was a sense of every individual kind of having to step up and play their part. But what that part was occasionally kind of difficult to suss out exactly what they were supposed to be doing. And it's interesting, I heard you talk about the sort of international quarantines and immigration and things as well as the end. They attempted to impose quarantines and things like that, but it wasn't as easily able to be enforced. And I think that from what I gathered, it felt like the onus was very much on the individual at the time to quarantine, to separate themselves, which for most Americans was virtually impossible to do in the early in the early 20th century. So I think that a lot of what I gathered was that there was this sense of just kind of fear. People didn't know what to do with their children. And then on top of that, we see the newspapers reporting in a really, really dramatic fashion, like I was showing you. So I think that a question that I don't have the answer to necessarily, but that I think about a lot when I give this program is, what did the average person who read all of these very like flashy big headlines, what were they thinking while they saw that? Because I could say that if I was reading headlines written exactly in that way in 2020, I probably would have felt even more intensely fearful. So I think that it's kind of a tricky question to answer. We don't have as many kind of first person experiences from 1918 as we would have liked. But that's why we're working so hard now to document everyone's personal experiences. So I'm sorry that I don't have a great answer to that question, but I would say that a lot of the things that we've all been feeling over the past 18 months or so seem to be pretty similar to how people felt in 1918 as well.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for Maggie Kase? Oh, Marlene is raising her hand. I think you could see. Yes, Marlene, speak loud as possible, please.
Okay, and I don't know that this is the same, but I think when you first, the fear element kind of started to sink in about what we have here. And all I can go back to is like World War II. I was a little kid. So what do? I named my chickens after bomber names or things. And we had a victory farm. I'm not sure how that helped, but it did. It seemed like we were trying to help make sure everybody was getting food if they needed it. They really didn't fight on the bit, but we still knew that we had to do something to keep so that people didn't run out of food. There was more of a team stance. I know we can't stop the bacteria by planting victory park, but at that time, it was looking around what we believed. For one thing, we believed a lot more of what the experts were saying. And if they said those were something airplanes, by golly, they were. And we were going to buy victory stamps or whatever it was we bought that came out from that. And now it seems like I'm hearing more, not from close friends, but from church folks that are more not worried about things, but more effort involved. Rather than I'm not going to do this because the government says, it can't be that much of a difference. Well, in those days, if you said wear a mask and it say one half of the people in the house that live across the street, then let's do it, And I don't hear that, people don't believe, I don't think, like they're acceptable, they're not realize. I believe it's in Houston, that was Seattle Times, but that's not what I mean. I mean that we've all had more science in grade school than we did in 20 as far as learning about how bacteria can feed up on you, even though they're a lot smaller. Does that make any sense? I don't.
Oh, yeah.
I don't really agree with what I'm saying, but that's what I'm seeing, because I was planting the victory garden. My mother was a heroin board and had a helmet and that bucket of sand. So anyway, it's so different in that respect. We're waiting for people to tell us what they have done. Don't make us laugh then. Anyway,
Thank you, Tricia.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think I wasn't able to catch every single word that you said, but I think that you had a lot of really interesting things to say about the ways in which a couple of decades can really make a difference in how people understand and think about the experts. And I think also what you were saying about a team mentality versus an individual mentality, especially in comparison to like World War II, for example, I think it really, to me, illustrates the ways in which society can be kind of cyclical in that sense, the ways in which sometimes we find it really easy to band together and sometimes we don't. And I think it also, to me, really makes me think about um, the ways in which history can kind of repeat itself, and how disease specifically can really shake people to their core, I think. But thank you so much for sharing that experience. That was really great, and I'll give that a little bit more thought as well as I think about my next iteration of this program.
Thank you, Maggie. We appreciate that. Yeah, I think it would be interesting, just to piggyback off of what Marlene was saying, how many people seem to be rebellious towards the mask mandate back in 1918 versus today. That would be just fascinating information. Any other questions for Maggie? Oh, we do have one more, and that is from Donna in the very back.
I'm not sure this is a question, more like a comment, that I've never, I think in the last 15 years in a group meeting where somebody doesn't mention that they was very worried about their grandchildren who have never experienced, tragedy kind of situation that's widespread, and how they handle it. That it's an age thing that, older people gone through probably depression and a war of one kind or another, and all kinds of, and an epidemic. But the youth seems to have skipped that.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't able to hear everything that was said. Can I have a quick summary, please?
Sure. What Donna's saying is she would like to emphasize how the pandemic of this generation has impacted young people and how they handle it, because of course they haven't gone through any depressions or wars and conflicts, and how possibly, would you like her to compare 1918, how they handled it with children as well? With children, of course, we know from your presentation that kids during 1918 unfortunately were impacted by the 1918 pandemic. Donna arrived just slightly after you said that. And of course, now this pandemic seems to not really have an increased risk for young people. But just would like to understand how pandemics affect young people.
Yeah, absolutely. In 1918, especially, it was really, really difficult to find um, a child's perspective, I would say, on what they were thinking. I was able to find a lot of information about what adults' concerns were for them, for sure, especially with the school situation. That really was one of the absolute most contentious decisions that was made, was to close the schools in Seattle in 1918. The superintendent actually said that they made that decision without him, and he felt very strongly that it was the wrong move and that children were just going to kind of run around and be at a lot higher risk. And I was able to read a little bit of some of the diary entries we have from 2020 from some young people. I have to be a little bit careful about that right now, of course, because they're still minors. So even though they've submitted those thoughts to us, I just have to be thoughtful, I think, about what I share there. But one of the ones that really struck me was the 14-year-old who was planning her birthday. She had everything planned out, laid out, and things like that. And then afterwards, she's talking about her birthday party, and it seems kind of innocuous. And she starts wondering if the world has always been this wild, essentially, and she was too young to notice, or if things were really changing and starting to fall apart in front of her eyes. And I would say that that was a theme, especially for kids, I would say above 12 or 13, that I saw a bit of in the diaries that we collected, was this idea of, has everything always been like this? Is the world going to change forever as I know it? And then I had one or two diary entries from younger children than that who, um, at least from what they submitted to us, didn't seem to super understand the impacts of what were happening, but were really just struck by the fact that suddenly they were home. And for many of them, they were around their parents, and school was different, and they missed their friends and things like that. But I think that the anxiety around illness, especially considering the fact that the 1918 pandemic affected younger children much more strongly than we've seen the COVID-19 pandemic statistically, is definitely a different and much more nuanced layer to what was happening in the past than what's happening now in terms of people's responses.
Donna is nodding her head.
Thank you.
And
Yeah, no problem.
Does any have this, give evidence of the fact of poor history teaching and poor science teaching in our school?
oh, that's a very good question. Fred was asking, does the way we reacted to COVID-19 here in America have anything to do with his opinion of poor science teaching, poor history teaching? And maybe that's why we have a reaction of a certain way.
Well, I can't answer that question in like an official capacity of like the historical society. I can only tell you my personal opinion. And I think that better understanding of science education and better understanding of history can only help us in these scenarios. And we've seen some inconsistencies with that and with those outcomes, I think, over the past couple of decades. And I suppose that I will leave it at that because I'm an official representative of my organization right now.
We really appreciate you being here today. All of us, I think, have learned an extra. Oh, I'm sorry, there's one more question. Don has a question. Go ahead.
Chicken pox and the smallpox.
Oh, his question is, there's chicken pox and smallpox. How does that relate to?
Are they the same disease?
Oh, his question is, are they the same disease and how it relates to COVID-19?
I think that the microphone got turned away from you for a second. Would you mind moving the camera and repeating that question? Sorry, Don.
Oh, sorry. Don's question is, there's smallpox and chickenpox, and he first of all wants to know if that's the same, and then the second part is, how is that related to COVID-19?
That's a great question. So smallpox and chickenpox are two separate diseases. Smallpox is actually the only human disease that we've ever eradicated. It's been eradicated since the early 1980s. And chickenpox is still circulating, although controlled, I believe, at least in the United States, which means that the number of cases of chickenpox every year doesn't overwhelm the population. And I would say that it influences or changes the way we think about COVID-19 in the sense that, disease eradication is something that we're still thinking about a lot. I think that when people talk about the fact that we really have to learn to live with COVID-19, they're thinking about the fact that we've only successfully currently eradicated one disease. And then I think as well, when we're thinking about vaccines and things like that, we're really able to see that widespread vaccination can really help us control diseases so that they don't continue to overwhelm our population.
Started first grade.
Oh, Donna said he started first grade.
They vaccinated all the first graders for smallpox.
They vaccinated all the first graders for smallpox. Yes, to prevent smallpox, yes. Yes, and who knows, maybe that's gonna happen with COVID. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll see with these mass vaccination campaigns. Sorry, I've been talking for a while, tripping over my words now. It's possible that we'll see similar techniques to that. It's really fascinating to me as somebody who knows a little bit about the history of disease that you were a teacher during the time when they were doing those mass vaccinations for smallpox. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Well, we thank you so very much. I think we don't have any more questions. We thank you for all of your time and your insight.
Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you everybody up on the fourth floor for your insightful questions. It was really fun fun is the wrong word to attach to a pandemic, but it was really enlightening to hear the presentation and also to hear your questions. Maggie, do you have any last words on this one?
Thank
Before we
you all
end?
so much for coming and for your really great and insightful questions. I really, really appreciate it. And I think I'm going to be coming back in a couple of weeks to do a different presentation. So if you liked what I had to say, tune in on August 16th, I believe.
Yes, it is August 16th. Absolutely. And we'll get the word out about that. Thanks so much, everybody, and viewers of the future. We're going to stop recording now.